My name is Clara Whitfield. I am 28 years old. And 6 months ago, my sister and my parents destroyed the one thing my grandmother spent her entire life building. They flooded my flower shop. They ripped out every root, shattered every vase, and poured bleach across 3 generations of legacy. But when the judge opened a sealed envelope in court, the truth that came out silenced every single person in that room and changed my family forever. Let me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear how the people I trusted most tried to ruin me and what happened when the truth finally came out. Primrose Gardens was not just a flower shop. It was an institution. My grandmother, Helen Whitfield, opened it in 1,971 inches, a small brick building on Cedar Lane in Ashford, South Carolina. She was 23 years old, freshly widowed with a baby daughter, and all she had was $200, a rented storefront, and a gift for making things grow. Within a decade, Primrose Gardens had become the place where people in Ashford came for every occasion that mattered. Weddings, funerals, proms, anniversaries, hospital visits, apologies, declarations of love. If something important happened in that town, my grandmother's arrangements were part of it. I spent my childhood in that shop. While my older sister Jenna was enrolled in dance classes, horseback riding lessons, and private tutoring sessions my parents could barely afford, I was at Primrose Gardens every weekend and every school break, standing on a step stool beside my grandmother, learning to strip thorns from roses without drawing blood. By the time I was 8, I could identify 50 varieties of flowers by scent alone. By 12, my grandmother trusted me to assemble centerpieces for small events. By 15, I was designing wedding arrangements that brides specifically requested. Those years with my grandmother shaped everything I became. She taught me about soil acidity and seasonal blooms, yes, but she also taught me patience, discipline, and the quiet satisfaction of creating beauty from nothing. She would say, "Clara, honey, flowers do not lie. You give them the right soil and the right light, and they will always show you who they really are." People are the same way. My sister Jenna was 3 years older than me and had been my parents' priority from the moment she was born. She was the firstborn, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. When Jenna wanted to attend an expensive summer arts program in New York, my parents remortgaged their house. When I asked for money to attend a 2-week horticulture workshop at the state university, my mother said we could not afford luxuries for everyone. When Jenna totaled her brand new car at 19, my father replaced it within the month. When my 12-year-old bicycle finally fell apart, I saved up from odd jobs for 6 months to buy a used one. The favoritism was never subtle. It was a fact of life in our household, as constant and unremarkable as the weather. Jenna was special. Jenna had potential. Jenna needed support. And Clara, well, Clara had Grandma Helen and her little flower shop, and that seemed to be enough for everyone. The gap between us only widened as we grew older. I graduated with honors from the University of South Carolina, with a degree in botany and business management, working 2 part-time jobs to pay my tuition. Jenna dropped out of 3 different colleges, bounced between careers she abandoned within months, and accumulated credit card debt that my parents quietly paid off again and again. She had charm in abundance and ambition in short supply. She expected the world to accommodate her, because our parents always had. Despite all of this, Primrose Gardens remained my anchor. Every arrangement I created, every satisfied bride, every grieving family who told me my grandmother's flowers brought them comfort, reinforced my sense of purpose. I was carrying on something meaningful, something that mattered beyond my own small life. My grandmother recognized this. We never had a formal conversation about succession, but there was an understanding between us as clear as sunlight. When she turned 75 and her arthritis made it painful to work the shears, I began taking over more responsibilities. By the time I was 25, I was effectively running the shop while she supervised from her favorite chair by the window, offering advice and occasionally scolding me for cutting stems at the wrong angle. My parents visited Primrose Gardens perhaps twice a year, always with an air of obligation. My father considered flower arranging a quaint hobby, not a real career. My mother would glance around the shop and suggest that maybe it was time for Grandma Helen to retire and sell the building. Jenna never came at all. She once told me at Thanksgiving dinner that she did not understand why I wasted my life playing in dirt when I could be doing something that actually mattered. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in November. I was at the wholesale flower market selecting peonies for a wedding that weekend when my phone rang. It was my grandmother's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, her voice shaking as she told me that Grandma Helen had collapsed in the greenhouse behind the shop. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was gone. A stroke, sudden and massive. The doctors said she likely did not suffer, but I suffered. I have not stopped suffering since. The funeral was exactly what my grandmother would have hated. My parents organized an elaborate service at the largest church in town, with expensive flower arrangements from a chain florist, not from Primrose Gardens. They invited people my grandmother barely knew, colleagues and social contacts they wanted to impress. I stood in the receiving line, shaking hands with strangers. While inside, I felt like someone had scooped out my chest and left nothing but a hollow space where my heart used to be. 1 week later, we gathered at the office of my grandmother's attorney, Mr. Dawson. My parents sat on one side of the conference table, dressed as though they were attending a board meeting. Jenna slouched between them, scrolling through her phone. I sat on the opposite side, still wearing the same black sweater I had worn to the funeral. Mr. Dawson read through the minor bequests first. Small amounts to longtime employees and a donation to the Ashford community garden. Then he reached the section that changed everything. To my granddaughter, Clara Whitfield, I leave Primrose Gardens in its entirety, including the building, all business assets, the attached greenhouse, and the apartment above the shop. She has been the soul of this place as much as I have. I trust her to carry it forward. The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then my father slammed his palm on the table so hard the water glasses rattled. "This is unacceptable," he said, his face turning a deep shade of red. "That property is worth a fortune. It should be divided among the family." My mother began crying immediately, loud, theatrical sobs that seemed designed for an audience rather than an expression of genuine grief. And Jenna stood up, her phone clattering to the floor, and pointed a finger directly at my face. "You manipulated her," she hissed. "You spent all those years sucking up to her just so you could steal everything from us." Mr. Dawson, to his credit, remained completely calm. He produced a sealed letter from my grandmother. "Mrs. Whitfield anticipated this reaction," he said. She asked me to read this aloud. The letter, written in my grandmother's careful handwriting, explained her decision with painful clarity. She described watching me dedicate years to learning every aspect of the business. She described Jenna's complete disinterest in the shop, her refusal to even visit, her openly dismissive attitude toward the work. She described my parents' repeated suggestions that she sell the property for cash. "I am not punishing anyone," my grandmother wrote. "I am protecting the thing I built. Clara is the only person in this family who understands what Primrose Gardens means. I will not allow it to be sold off or neglected by people who see it as nothing more than a check to cash." My father demanded to know if the will could be contested. Mr. Dawson informed him that my grandmother had updated her documents 8 months prior with 2 independent physicians certifying her mental competency. The bequest was legally airtight. What followed was a siege. My family declared war on me with a ferocity I had not imagined possible. My father called me every single morning for 3 weeks straight, alternating between threats and ultimatums. "Either you sign over half that property to your sister, or you are dead to this family." My mother sent long, guilt-laden text messages about how I was tearing the family apart, how my grandmother would be ashamed of my selfishness. Jenna posted thinly veiled attacks on social media, calling me a manipulator and a thief without using my name, though everyone in our small town knew exactly who she meant. Relatives I had not spoken to in years suddenly called, coached by my parents, urging me to do the right thing and share. Family friends weighed in with opinions no one had asked for. I received a letter from my mother's church group suggesting I pray for guidance about honoring my family obligations. Through all of it, I held on to my grandmother's letter. I read it every night before sleep, drawing strength from her words. She had seen this coming. She had known exactly what my family would do, and she had chosen me anyway, not because I was her favorite, but because I was the one who showed up. Year after year, day after day, in the heat of summer and the cold of winter, because I loved the work and I loved her. So I held firm. Primrose Gardens was mine. I would honor my grandmother's legacy. Taking over the shop full-time was overwhelming. Running a business alongside my grandmother was entirely different from running it alone. There were vendor contracts I did not understand, seasonal ordering schedules I had to master quickly, and an ancient accounting system that existed mostly in my grandmother's memory. But I adapted. I kept her classic arrangements that loyal customers depended on while introducing modern designs that attracted younger clientele. I launched an online ordering system, partnered with local wedding planners, and started a weekly flower arranging workshop that became so popular I had to add a second session. Within 4 months, revenue was up 20%. This success only made my family angrier. Jenna began showing up at the shop during business hours, loudly accusing me of theft in front of customers. One Saturday morning during peak wedding season, she walked in, grabbed a completed bridal arrangement worth $800, and hurled it against the wall, screaming that I had stolen her future. I called the police. She was escorted out. The next day, my father left a voicemail that I have saved to this day. "You had your sister arrested over flowers," he said, his voice low and controlled and absolutely terrifying. "There will be consequences for this, Clara. Serious consequences." That afternoon, I called a security company. I installed cameras throughout the shop, the greenhouse, and the exterior of the building, all connected to cloud-based storage that backed up footage in real time to a remote server. I also installed a monitored alarm system with fire, flood, and intrusion sensors that would alert both me and the security company simultaneously. My grandmother had never needed these things, but my grandmother had never been at war with her own family. I also filed for a restraining order against Jenna and hired a part-time security guard for weekends. My staff, many of whom had worked with my grandmother for decades, rallied around me. They covered shifts when I was exhausted, brought me meals when I forgot to eat, and stood as witnesses when I filed the restraining order. One employee in particular became my closest ally. Marcus had started at Primrose Gardens as a delivery driver during college and had stayed, eventually becoming our head designer. He had known my grandmother well, had learned from her just as I had, and he understood what the shop meant to both of us. "Helen talked about you constantly," he told me one evening after closing, as we cleaned up from a long day. "She used to say you were the only one who got it, the only one who understood that this place was not about money. It was about making people's lives more beautiful, one arrangement at a time." His words kept me going during the darkest weeks, because even with the restraining order, even with the security system, I could feel something building. My parents had gone quiet. Jenna had stopped her public tantrums. The silence was worse than the shouting. It felt like the moment before a storm breaks. The alarm went off at 3:42 inches the morning. My phone lit up simultaneously with alerts from the security company and the flood sensors. I called 911 while I was still pulling on my shoes, and I drove to Cedar Lane so fast I do not remember a single turn I made. When I arrived, water was pouring out from under the front door of Primrose Gardens. Inside, every pipe had been deliberately severed. The main water line had been opened at full force. The entire ground floor was under 6 inches of water and rising. The walk-in cooler where I stored thousands of dollars of fresh inventory had been pried open. Every arrangement, every stem, every petal was scattered across the flooded floor. The antique display cases my grandmother had collected over 50 years were overturned and shattered. The greenhouse door stood open, and inside, someone had poured bleach across every planting bed, every seedling, every cutting I had been nurturing. The smell hit me before I even stepped through the doorway. Chlorine and death. 3 generations of carefully cultivated rootstock destroyed in minutes. But the worst part was what they had done to the wall behind the register. My grandmother's wall of memories, where she had displayed photographs of every wedding she had ever done flowers for, 50 years of brides and grooms smiling beside her arrangements. Every single photograph had been torn down and shredded. 50 years of history, ripped to pieces and left floating in the floodwater like confetti. I stood in the middle of that devastation, water soaking through my shoes, and I did not cry. I was beyond crying. I felt something inside me go very still and very cold, like a door closing quietly and locking shut. The police arrived 20 minutes later. The fire department came to help with the water. And when the detective asked if I had any idea who might have done this, I told him to check my cloud-based security footage. Because unlike the perpetrators apparently believed, My cameras did not store footage locally. Every second of video was uploaded in real time to a secure server 300 miles away. The footage was clear and damning. At 2:15 inches the morning, two figures approached the rear entrance of Primrose Gardens using a key. My father's key? The one my grandmother had given him years ago that I had forgotten to change the locks for. Even in the dim lighting, their identities were unmistakable. My father's heavy, deliberate stride, Jenna's long ponytail swinging as she carried a jug of industrial bleach. They spent 47 minutes inside the shop, methodically destroying everything. The footage showed them laughing at one point. Laughing, while they tore my grandmother's photographs off the wall. The police made arrests that same afternoon. My father was picked up at his office. Jenna was taken from her apartment. Both were charged with breaking and entering, destruction of property, and vandalism. That evening, my mother called. The first words out of her mouth were not, "I am sorry." They were, "How could you do this to your family, Clara?" I almost laughed. Almost. "They destroyed Grandma's shop," I said. "They destroyed 50 years of her work. It would not have happened if you had just been fair," my mother replied, her voice cracking. "If you had just given Jenna her share, none of this would have happened. Now your father and your sister are in jail, and it is all your fault. You need to tell the police it was a misunderstanding." I hung up. I did not call her back. In the days after, Marcus appeared at my apartment with a folder. He looked exhausted but determined. "I have been going through your grandmother's business records," he said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. And I found something. 2 months before she died, someone applied for a commercial property appraisal on Primrose Gardens. The application lists your father as the property owner. I stared at the document, but he was never the owner. "Exactly," Marcus said. "He filed this while your grandmother was still alive. And look at the estimated value." He pointed to a number that made my stomach drop. The building and land were worth nearly $1.2 million, 4 times what I would have guessed. Cedar Lane had been rezoned for mixed-use development the previous year, and property values had skyrocketed. "This was never about fairness or family," Marcus said quietly. "This was about money. A lot of money." He was right, and the evidence only got worse. When my attorney, Rachel Chen, subpoenaed my father's and Jenna's financial records, we discovered emails dating back over a year. My father and Jenna had been planning to pressure me into sharing ownership and then force a sale to a developer who had already made a preliminary offer. When I refused to give up any portion of the business, they escalated to destruction, believing that if the shop was ruined, I would have no choice but to sell the property. One email from my father to Jenna, sent 3 days before the attack, read, "The building is what matters. The flower nonsense is irrelevant. Once she has nothing left to run, she will sell. She has no choice." The flower nonsense. That is what my father called 50 years of my grandmother's life work. The trial began on a Monday in April. The courthouse in Ashford was small, and every seat was taken. Half the town had some connection to Primrose Gardens. They had bought corsages for their daughters' proms there, ordered funeral sprays for their parents, picked up anniversary bouquets on their way home from work. This was personal for the whole community. The prosecution laid out the case methodically. The security footage, the emails, the financial records showing the property appraisal and the developer's offer. The forensic analysis of the bleach containers, which were traced back to a purchase made on my father's credit card 2 days before the break-in. My father's defense attorney tried the same strategy I had expected. He painted a picture of a family divided by an unfair inheritance, a grieving father pushed to his breaking point by a daughter who refused to share. My client made a terrible mistake born from pain, he argued. But the evidence of premeditation destroyed that narrative completely. This was not a moment of rage. This was weeks of planning, financial scheming, and calculated destruction. When I took the stand, I told my story without embellishment. I described my years at Primrose Gardens, my grandmother's mentorship, the harassment campaign after the will reading, the escalation to violence. I described standing in 6 inches of water at 4 a.m, watching my grandmother's photographs float past my feet. Jenna testified next. Under cross-examination, she fell apart quickly, contradicting herself, blaming our father, then blaming me, then crying and refusing to answer questions. My father maintained his composure longer but crumbled when confronted with the emails. He had no explanation for the flower. Nonsense is irrelevant that did not make him sound exactly like the calculating, contemptuous man he was. On the third day of the trial, Judge Robert Callahan made an announcement that no one expected. During the course of this proceeding, he said, the court received a sealed envelope from the estate of Helen Whitfield, with instructions that it be opened only in the event of legal proceedings involving the family and Primrose Gardens. The courtroom went absolutely silent. The judge opened the envelope and reviewed its contents. His expression shifted from neutral to grim to something that looked very much like anger. Then he read aloud. The envelope contained a letter from my grandmother, written 14 months before her death, and a set of documents. The letter began, "If this is being read, it means my family has done exactly what I feared they would do." She went on to describe how, 18 months before her death, my father and my mother had approached her with a proposal. They wanted her to add Jenna as co-owner of Primrose Gardens and the building, arguing that it was only fair. When my grandmother refused, they threatened to have her declared mentally incompetent and seize control of her assets through a conservatorship. My grandmother, being the sharp and prepared woman she was, had immediately contacted her attorney. She had herself evaluated by 2 independent physicians, updated her will with additional protections, and documented every interaction with my parents going forward. But the letter contained one more revelation. My grandmother had discovered, through documents she found in my father's desk during a family dinner, that my parents had been siphoning money from her personal savings account for years. They had been listed as emergency contacts on the account and had exploited that access to make withdrawals totaling over $90,000 without her knowledge. Money that had gone to paying off Jenna's debts, funding her failed ventures, and maintaining my parents' lifestyle. They have been stealing from me for years, my grandmother wrote. And they will try to steal from Clara when I am gone. I am leaving this letter as protection, because I know my granddaughter. She will try to see the best in them. She will hesitate to fight back, so I am fighting for her even from the grave. The courtroom erupted. My mother, sitting in the gallery, let out a sound that was half scream, half sob, and buried her face in her hands. My father sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, as if he had turned to stone. Jenna was crying openly, but whether from shock or shame I could not tell. Judge Callahan called for order. When the room finally quieted, he addressed my father directly. Mr. Whitfield, you have heard the contents of this letter. The court has also received bank records corroborating the alleged unauthorized withdrawals. Do you wish to respond? My father said nothing for a long moment. Then, in a voice I barely recognized, he said, "It is true." 3 words. 3 words that confirmed my grandmother had spent her final years knowing that her own son was robbing her. That she had gone to sleep every night carrying that knowledge and still chosen to protect me rather than confront him, because she knew confrontation would only accelerate their schemes. The judge's ruling was decisive. My father received 4 years in prison for the destruction of Primrose Gardens, plus additional charges were referred to the district attorney for the financial fraud against my grandmother's accounts. Jenna received 2 years with mandatory restitution. Both were ordered to pay for the full cost of repairs and lost business revenue. The judge also recommended that the DA investigate my mother's involvement in the financial theft, noting that as a joint account holder with my father, her claim of ignorance was difficult to credit. As the verdict was read, I felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Just a bone-deep exhaustion and a grief that went far beyond the loss of property. I had lost my family. Not that day, not during the trial, but years ago. Slowly, invisibly, in 1,000 small betrayals I had been too young or too hopeful to recognize. The rebuilding took 8 months. Insurance covered a significant portion of the structural repairs, and the restitution payments, slow as they were, helped fund the rest. Marcus stepped up as my business partner, handling operations while I focused on what I did best, growing things. We rebuilt the greenhouse first. I sourced new rootstock from botanical gardens across the southeast, including several heritage rose varieties that my grandmother had originally cultivated. A local historian helped me recover copies of some of the wedding photographs that had been destroyed, reaching out to families who had kept their own prints. We could not restore them all, but the new wall of memories was growing, one photograph at a time. I renamed the shop Helen's Garden. Not Primrose Gardens, not exactly what it was before, because it could never be exactly what it was before, but something that honored where it came from while acknowledging that it was moving forward. 6 months after the verdict, I received a letter from Jenna. It was short, written in handwriting that looked like it had taken effort, as if each word cost her something. "I am in a counseling program as part of my sentence," she wrote. "My therapist asked me to write down the moment I knew what we were doing was wrong. I told her it was when I poured the bleach on the seedlings and I saw the labels you had written on each pot in Grandma's handwriting. You had kept her original labels. You were growing her plants. And I destroyed them anyway. I do not expect you to forgive me. I am just trying to understand who I was that night. And I do not like what I see." I did not write back. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I was not ready. Forgiveness is not something you can force or schedule. It either grows in its own time, like any living thing, or it does not. My father wrote too, eventually. His letter was longer, more formal, and less convincing. He expressed regret in careful language that sounded like it had been drafted with legal advice. I read it once, put it in a drawer, and did not think about it again for weeks. My mother I have not heard from. According to a cousin, she moved to Florida after the trial and does not speak about what happened. I do not know if she was ever charged for the financial fraud. I do not ask. The day Helen's Garden opened for business, the line stretched halfway down Cedar Lane. Former Primrose Gardens customers came with cards, with flowers of their own, with stories about my grandmother that made me laugh and cry in equal measure. Marcus stood beside me as I cut the ribbon, steady and calm as always, the kind of partner my grandmother would have approved of. Inside, the shop smelled like fresh cedar and roses, just as it always had. The new display cases held arrangements I had designed using my grandmother's techniques and my own eye. The greenhouse out back was green and thriving, full of seedlings that would become next season's inventory. And on the wall behind the register in a simple frame hung my grandmother's letter. Not the one read in court, the one she gave me on my 21st birthday. "Clara," it read, "you have the same stubborn roots I do. That is not a flaw. That is your greatest strength. Some people will try to pull you out of the ground. Let them try. You will only grow back stronger." She was right. She was always right. I am standing in her garden and it is blooming. What is the hardest thing your family has ever put you through? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Remember to like this video if it meant something to you. Subscribe to hear more real-life experiences. And share it with someone who needs to know that even after the worst betrayal, it is possible to rebuild. Thank you for being here today. And remember, the people who try to destroy your roots only prove how deep they go.